It's time now to look at what's been making newspaper headlines across the week. Joining us now is Teddy Cook, who's ANCON's Acting Director of Community Health and Wellbeing and Vice President of the Australian Professional Association for Trans Health. Good morning to you, Teddy. Great to have you on the program this morning. We're actually going to start off with an op-ed that you've written in The Guardian, and this comes, of course, during this week where we've seen the Religious Discrimination Bill debated in Parliament, but now put on ice and delayed likely till after the election. Well, how's this week been for you, Teddy?
Morning, everyone. It's been a real roller coaster of a week, I have to say. So many feelings and emotions going throughout our community. But one of the most powerful things that I've seen is really the countrywide support for trans people in a way that I have to say I've never seen before. And even though this, I have to say, very flawed bill has been shelved for now, the narrative over the last week in particular has been, it makes me quite queasy, to be honest, that there's such a focus on young, vulnerable people trying to get an education. We're talking about a population that is actually pretty small. We really aren't trying to break down society as we know it. We're seen as a threat. And that impacts our health and well-being.
It does. Teddy, in your op-ed, and it's very moving and very, very powerful, you say trans people are not an ideology, we are real and we are someone you know. You started off your answer there by saying, you're quite overwhelmed by the response that this discussion has sort of struck. Do you think Australians are a lot more aware of what trans people are going through because of these discussions that are being held in Parliament?
Look, I think discussions happening in Parliament in some way do reflect what's happening out in society, but the overwhelming experience that I've had this week is that Australians understand that diversity is good and that children have a right to education and to be respected as who they are. I do see the Australian public getting behind our communities, getting behind LGBTQI plus communities and young people and adults and older people. Our community is across every other community group as well. There are many of us who hold very, very deep faiths and should be protected. I've seen people of faith be terribly discriminated against. I'm talking about LGBTQ plus people, particularly trans people who are Jewish, who are Muslim, who are Sikh. Many are Christians. I know trans ministers, including Reverend Inkpen at the Uniting Church in the middle of the city, a trans woman uniting priest who her parishioners just adore her. What we see in other countries is this rising politicisation, I have to say sexualisation of young people, and it's grim. But it's not happening here. The voices that would be against us who are threatened by trans people, and really that fear, it isn't actually about us at all. It's offering an opportunity for people to reflect on who they are, lean into themselves and just continue into their lives.
That also brings us to the second article that we're looking at, which is from the Sydney Morning Herald this morning, and it's about how single-sex schools in particular respond to transgender students. What's this article saying, Teddy?
Well, this article is telling us that schools across this country are already supporting and working with trans kids. There are trans kids in every school already. I spent 5 years working across regional New South Wales, from the middle of nowhere to the middle of nowhere. And trans people and trans kids were everywhere. And schools are grappling with how to support all of their diverse students, their unexpectedly special students. Trans people, trans kids aren't particularly that different. In the same sort of ways, it might be an interesting thing to have a kid who plays 5 musical instruments, who has an interesting family background, who has this, comes from different kinds of histories and different kinds of ways of being. And the most important thing is that education is a right, and when we don't have access to it, we see long-term poorer health outcomes. And I don't know anyone in this country who would stand for that.
Indeed. I think a lot of Australians would agree with you there. Teddy, we want to move on to something maybe a little bit lighter. And, you know, we've heard about this great resignation that's happening in the United States and in the UK. Everyone perhaps refocusing their priorities and perhaps trying to get some sort of work-life balance here, which means that they might be resigning from their jobs. Now, a particular social media company in Australia is trying to stop that from happening. Tell us about this story in news.com.au.
I saw that. I saw that. The company Linktree is realising that over the course of the COVID pandemic, people's priorities have shifted and changed, and have realised they need to support their workforce in interesting and new and different ways. I have to say, though, working at an NGO throughout this pandemic at ACON, our support services have been completely overwhelmed. All of our fundraising opportunities have really been impacted because our work hasn't stopped. The work of supporting our communities hasn't stopped. But when I first read this article, I thought to myself, $6,000. I love that, you know, a person talks about buying solar panels for their roof, and I have to say my first thought was, what's the biggest Lego set that I could get? And then what's going to happen next? And I thought, I really am not about to buy solar panels. But everyone's priorities have had a really interesting shift, I think.
Yeah, they certainly have. Yeah, they certainly have. Teddy, it's been great having you on Weekend Breakfast. Thank you so much for sharing the articles with us, articles that are close to your heart. And thank you for having a laugh with us. Teddy Cook there from ACON.